There was a flyer left on my windshield at work. I hadn't thought too deeply about it. A bold, red advertisement promising a chance to win $50,000 for beating a single night in the most intense escape room ever designed. The tagline, "Test your limits, claim the prize," was impossible to ignore, especially after I'd read the smaller print below. Participants will face real psychological and physical challenges, fully monitored and supervised for safety. I wasn't desperate for money, but the idea intrigued me. I'd tried escape rooms before, mostly as team-building exercises with coworkers, and while I wouldn't call myself an expert, I wasn't half bad. It was the thrill of something unique that hooked me, a chance to do something no one I knew had done before. The flyer had a QR code, so I scanned it that evening. The website was slick, professional even, with testimonials from supposed past players describing how exhilarating the experience had been. It boasted an immersive environment and puzzles designed by world-class game creators. The catch? It was invitation only, and I'd been selected because of some mysterious vetting process. That should have raised a red flag, but I told myself that this level of exclusivity made it feel legitimate. Besides, the application process required me to submit basic information and a liability waiver. There was also a cryptic clause about signing away my rights to back out after entering the game, which I brushed off as legal jargon. A few days later, I got an email congratulating me on my acceptance, along with the address for the challenge. The location was a nondescript building in an industrial district about an hour from my place. I arrived around 8:30 p.m. on a Friday night, half expecting to find a crowd of participants. But the lot was empty except for a single unmarked van and a plain metal door with a keypad. A young woman wearing a headset greeted me after I buzzed in, her demeanor friendly but efficient, like someone used to dealing with anxious contestants. She led me down a narrow hallway lit by sterile fluorescent lights, explaining the basic rules as we walked. "This is a solo experience," she said. "You'll have until 6 a.m. to complete the game, and your performance will determine the prize. If at any point you feel unsafe, there's a panic button in each room. Press it, and you'll be escorted out immediately, but doing so forfeits the prize." She handed me a laminated card with the rules printed in small, neat text, which I skimmed while she unlocked another door. Rule 1. Do not attempt to leave the building before the game concludes. Rule 2. Follow all instructions provided within each room. Rule 3. Do not tamper with surveillance equipment. Rule 4. Do not harm the game staff or interfere with their roles. Rule 5. Confession is the key to success. The last rule struck me as odd, but I didn't ask about it. I assumed it was some kind of gimmick, maybe a way to integrate storytelling into the puzzles. The woman left me in a small waiting area where I was asked to place my phone, wallet, and watch into a locker. She handed me a plain jumpsuit and asked me to change before entering the first room. "Everything you need will be provided," she said, her smile polite but distant. The first room was deceptively simple. It looked like an ordinary office, complete with a desk, chair, and filing cabinets. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, its hands set to midnight, though it was still well before that. A speaker crackled, and a calm, male voice welcomed me to the challenge, instructing me to find a key hidden somewhere in the room to unlock the next door. I felt the tension in my chest ease. This was familiar territory. I began searching, checking under the desk and flipping through the drawers. The puzzles were clever but solvable, each leading to a new clue that eventually revealed the key. The second room was more challenging, a mock-up of a workshop with tools and machinery. This time, the clues were harder to piece together. requiring me to disassemble a few items to find what I needed. The voice over the speaker returned occasionally, offering cryptic hints that felt more like taunts. "You're doing well," it said once. "But remember, time is your greatest enemy." By the time I entered the third room, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The decor had become darker, with faint, almost imperceptible scratches on the walls and furniture that looked deliberately aged. The puzzles became less about logic and more about intuition, forcing me to make decisions that felt uncomfortably personal. One task involved choosing between two objects: a pristine porcelain vase and a cracked, dusty mirror. The voice instructed me to smash one of them, and though it seemed arbitrary, I hesitated longer than I expected before picking the mirror. It was in the fourth room that I began to sense something was off. This one resembled a dimly lit bedroom, with a single twin bed and a nightstand. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of strangers, their faces obscured or scratched out. A faint, sour smell lingered in the air, like mildew mixed with something metallic. The instructions were vague this time: find what doesn't belong. I searched the room, rifling through drawers and lifting the mattress, but nothing stood out. It wasn't until I examined the photos more closely that I realized one of them featured me, though the face had been smeared beyond recognition. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, my pulse quickening. The voice returned, colder now. "You're getting closer," it said. I stood frozen, the muffled static from the speaker hanging in the air after the voice's chilling remark. My gaze lingered on the photo, and I tried to dismiss the unease building in my chest, telling myself it had to be a coincidence or part of the game's design. After all, escape rooms were supposed to mess with your head. It was their job to blur the line between reality and the experience. I shook my head, exhaling sharply, and forced myself to focus. There had to be something else in this room, something tangible to lead me to the next clue. I ran my fingers along the edges of the nightstand, pressed on the walls near the headboard of the bed, even checked under the floor rug. It was frustratingly ordinary, everything just slightly off-kilter but offering no immediate solution. The sound came first, a faint, rhythmic tapping like something hard hitting wood. It was so soft that, at first, I thought it was part of the ambient noise they'd been pumping through the room, just another tactic to unnerve me. But then it grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the closet. I hesitated, my hand hovering near the doorknob. My brain scrambled to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hidden mechanism, some kind of trick meant to play on my nerves. Still, I couldn't bring myself to open it immediately. Instead, I knelt down and pressed my ear against the door. The tapping stopped the moment I did. My breath hitched, and I sat back quickly, nearly stumbling. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It made the room feel heavier, as though the walls were pressing in. I stood, trying to calm myself, and reached for the knob again, this time determined to just get it over with. It was locked. There was no keyhole, no latch, nothing to suggest it could be opened at all. I tugged at it a few times before stepping back, thoroughly unnerved. Then, the voice returned. "You're hesitating. That's not like you." The words were sharper now, more intimate, as if the person speaking knew me far better than they should. I opened my mouth to say something, to shout at the speaker to stop messing with me, but I realized I didn't know if I was even being monitored live or if the recordings were pre-programmed. My chest tightened, and I decided to move on, searching the room again for anything I might have missed. The instructions had been clear: find what doesn't belong. But nothing here seemed out of place, save for the locked closet. I kept glancing at it, my stomach twisting every time my eyes lingered too long. I tried to focus on the bed again, pulling the sheets off and inspecting the mattress more thoroughly. As I lifted it, I noticed something strange. The frame beneath the mattress was scratched up, deep grooves etched into the wood as though someone had raked a sharp object across it repeatedly. At first, I thought it was just more atmosphere, a detail meant to unsettle me, but as I traced the scratches with my fingers, I noticed they weren't random. They formed a crude pattern like tally marks. There were dozens of them, some overlapping, some faint, but all clearly deliberate. I counted as I ran my hand along the length of the frame. 37 marks, each one etched with a force that must have splintered the wood. The unease creeping through me turned into something heavier, something I couldn't quite name. Then I noticed the smell. It wasn't the faint mildew I detected earlier, but something sharper, more chemical. I leaned closer to the tally marks, sniffing tentatively, and my nose wrinkled. It smelled faintly of bleach, but there was an undercurrent of something acrid beneath it, like rusted metal mixed with salt. I stepped back, the nausea rising in my throat as I thought it smelled like blood. Dried and scrubbed away, but blood nonetheless. A soft click broke the silence, and I whipped around. The closet door was open, just a crack. I stared at it, waiting for something, anything to happen. The tapping didn't return, and the room was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I inched toward the door, each step feeling like it took an eternity. When I reached it, I pushed it open slowly, half expecting something to leap out at me. But the closet was empty. No shelves, no clothes, nothing but a blank, dark space. I stepped inside, expecting to feel a wall at the back, but my foot landed on something that gave slightly under my weight. A trapdoor. The voice returned, louder this time. "You found it. Good." There was an edge to the words now, a faint mockery that made my skin crawl. I crouched down, running my hands over the wooden panel. There was no handle, but there was a small indent, just large enough for my fingers to grip. I hesitated again, my mind screaming at me to stop, to think, to do anything other than open that door. But I was in too deep now. My pride, my curiosity, whatever it was, kept me moving. I pulled the trapdoor open. The smell hit me first, that same acrid tang of blood mixed with something damp and earthy. The space beneath the trapdoor wasn't large, just a small dark compartment. Inside was a single object, an old rusted wrench. It looked out of place, too battered to be part of the carefully crafted set pieces in the other rooms. I reached down and picked it up, the cold metal slick with something I didn't want to identify. On its handle, faint but unmistakable, was a name engraved. My name. My stomach dropped. I stared at the wrench, my pulse racing as questions flooded my mind. How was this here? Who had put it here? The voice crackled back to life. "Keep going," it said, almost impatient now. "You've barely begun." The closet door slammed shut behind me, and the light in the room flickered once before going out completely. The room plunged into darkness, leaving me gripping the wrench like it was the only tether I had to reality. The sudden silence was deafening. No more ticking clock, no faint hum from the lights, just a hollow, oppressive quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stood frozen, listening, trying to anticipate the next move of whoever had designed this nightmare. My fingers tightened around the wrench, the cold, sticky residue on its surface making my stomach churn. My name engraved on it wasn't a coincidence. Couldn't be. But I shoved that thought aside for now. There had to be a logical explanation, right? Maybe this was their way of making the experience personalized, though the thought didn't bring me any comfort. After a few moments, a dim, red light flickered on overhead, bathing the room in a faint, unsettling glow. It wasn't enough to see everything clearly, just enough to cast long, distorted shadows across the walls and floor. The voice returned, calm but sharper than before. "You've taken your time. Let's see if you're ready to move forward." A loud metallic clang echoed from somewhere in the room, a sound that made me flinch, though I couldn't pinpoint its source. My eyes darted around, searching for the next clue, the next task, but the room was different now. The bed was gone, the nightstand too. The photographs that had lined the walls were replaced with plain, featureless panels, their surfaces marred with faint scratches that looked like desperate claw marks. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that this was just a game. The fear clawing at my chest was exactly what they wanted me to feel. That thought was the only thing keeping me moving. I forced myself to inspect the space again, searching for anything that might guide me forward. The wrench felt heavier in my hand, like its presence alone demanded I use it for something. But what? The trapdoor beneath the closet was still open, the dark space below now fully illuminated by the eerie red light. I crouched down to get a closer look, but there was nothing else inside, just the faint metallic scent lingering in the air. Then, something mechanical clicked behind me, and I turned sharply, my pulse spiking. One of the featureless panels had slid open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor. Its walls were lined with exposed pipes, their surfaces gleaming with moisture. The air that seeped through was damp and carried a faint, chemical tang that made my throat itch. I hesitated at the threshold, but I knew there wasn't another choice. This was the next step, and standing here frozen wouldn't help me. I gripped the wrench tighter and stepped inside, the door sliding shut behind me with a hiss as soon as I crossed the threshold. The corridor was tight, barely wide enough for me to move without my shoulders brushing the walls. The pipes hissed occasionally, releasing small bursts of steam that made the air uncomfortably warm. The floor beneath me was grated metal, and every step echoed loudly, as though I was announcing my presence to anyone or anything that might be ahead. The dim lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting the corridor in shifting shadows that made it impossible to tell if I was alone. Every few feet, I passed small maintenance hatches set into the walls, their bolts rusted and their surfaces dented as though someone, or something, had tried to pry them open. Halfway down the corridor, I stopped. Something was wrong. A faint dripping noise was coming from up ahead. I took a deep breath and continued, each step feeling more labored than the last. The corridor opened up into a small room, its walls covered in tarnished metal panels that reflected the dim light in strange, distorted ways. In the center of the room was a single chair bolted to the floor. On the chair sat a mannequin, its plastic surface cracked and discolored. The mannequin was dressed in what looked like an old jumpsuit, similar to the one I was wearing, though its fabric was torn and stained. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, and its hands were positioned on its lap, palms up. Resting in one of its hands was a folded piece of paper, the edges frayed as though it had been handled repeatedly. I didn't want to go near it. Everything about the setup screamed trap, but I couldn't ignore it either. This was clearly the next clue. Keeping the wrench raised in one hand, I approached slowly, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet space. As I reached out to take the paper, I noticed something else. The mannequin's other hand, the one resting empty on its lap, was missing fingers. The plastic stumps were jagged and uneven, as if they'd been torn off rather than broken. I tried not to think about it as I carefully plucked the paper from its hand, half expecting it to move, but it didn't. Unfolding the paper, I found a single sentence scrawled in bold, uneven handwriting. "Why did you do it?" My stomach twisted as I stared at the words. What was this? A way to rattle me before the next puzzle? I was about to fold the paper back up when I noticed a small, faint stain on the bottom corner. It was reddish-brown, and I didn't need to be a forensic expert to know what it was. Swallowing hard, I shoved the paper into my pocket and backed away from the mannequin. The voice crackled through the room again, louder and more distorted than before. "You're taking too long," it said. "Time is running out." As it spoke, the lights flickered violently, and the room seemed to shudder. A loud grinding noise filled the air, and I spun around to see one of the metal panels sliding open, revealing another corridor. This one was darker, the lights barely functional, and the dripping sound I'd heard earlier was louder now, echoing through the space. I didn't want to go forward. My gut was screaming at me to stop. To quit the game and press the panic button they'd promised was in every room. I didn't want to though, since my main drive was the $50,000. But I couldn't see any panic button now, and something told me I wouldn't find one in the next corridor either. I stood at the edge of the new corridor, staring into the darkness ahead, the faint, uneven flicker of light barely illuminating more than a few feet in front of me. I took a step forward, the sound of my boots against the grated floor echoing in the silence. With each step, the dripping noise from deeper in the corridor grew louder. The walls here were different. Instead of smooth, industrial metal, they were covered in scrawled writing. Words etched into the surface with something sharp, their edges jagged and uneven. I stopped to inspect one of the panels, holding the wrench tight in one hand as I leaned closer to make out the words. They weren't coherent sentences, just fragments. "Why didn't you stop?" "It's too late now." And "They know what you did." The writing varied in size, some phrases so small they were nearly invisible, while others sprawled across the panels in uneven, chaotic lines. It didn't feel like decoration. It felt frantic, desperate, as if someone had carved them into the walls in a fit of hysteria. My stomach churned as I noticed small dark smudges near the writing, as though whoever had done this had injured themselves in the process. At one point, I stopped dead in my tracks. The dripping noise, which had grown louder with each step, suddenly shifted. It wasn't random anymore, like the ticking of a clock. 3 drips, a pause. For drips, another pause. The pattern repeated, and as I stood there, frozen, I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for it to break. But it didn't. The dripping continued its unnerving rhythm. I forced myself to keep moving, my fingers gripping the wrench so tightly my knuckles ached. Eventually, the corridor opened up into another room. This one was way larger, the space dominated by a circular table in the center. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crammed with objects that made my skin crawl. Fragments of porcelain dolls, rusted tools, jars filled with what looked like discolored liquid. The air here was colder, almost icy, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me as I stepped into the room. The dripping noise was louder now, coming from somewhere above me. I glanced up, but the ceiling was shrouded in shadow, the faint red light from the corridor barely reaching into the room. On the table was a single object, a wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, its surface covered in deep scratches, as though someone had tried to claw their way inside. A small brass latch held it shut, and as I approached, I noticed something etched into the wood. It was a date, burned into the surface in shaky lettering, 04/12/20XX. The numbers felt significant, though I couldn't place why. My chest tightened as I stared at the box. But the voice from earlier had said time was running out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was another part of the game. I knelt down, inspecting the box more closely. There were more scratches near the latch, deeper and more concentrated, as though someone had been desperate to open it. My fingers hovered over the latch, and I hesitated, glancing back toward the corridor. It was still empty, the flickering light barely visible now, but the sense of being watched was suffocating. I flipped the latch and opened the box. Inside was a small, handheld recorder. It looked old, the kind of device you'd find in a thrift store, with worn buttons and faint scratches across its plastic surface. Beside it was a piece of paper, folded neatly and tucked into the corner of the box. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the note. The handwriting was familiar, but I couldn't immediately place why. It simply said, "Play the tape." I picked up the recorder, my thumb brushing against the play button as I debated what to do. This was what they wanted, wasn't it? For me to press play, to keep moving forward, to dig deeper into whatever twisted narrative they were creating. But a part of me hesitated, an irrational fear blooming in my chest as I stared at the device. Finally, I pressed the button. The tape whirred for a moment before a voice crackled through the small speaker. It wasn't the same voice from the intercom earlier. This one was different, more distorted, like it had been recorded over and over until the original clarity was lost. At first, I couldn't make out the words, just fragments buried beneath static. "Can't hide. Always watching. Why did you?" My blood ran cold as the static briefly cleared, and the voice said something chilling. "I know who you are." I dropped the recorder, the small device clattering against the table. My breathing was shallow now, panic creeping into the edges of my mind. I backed away from the table, my eyes darting around the room, searching for cameras, speakers, anything that could explain how this was happening. That was when I noticed something new. One of the jars on the shelves, a small, unassuming glass jar filled with murky liquid, had something inside it. A folded piece of paper, similar to the one I'd found in the box. It wasn't there when I entered the room. I was sure of it. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stepped toward the shelf, my hands shaking as I reached for the jar. The liquid inside sloshed slightly as I lifted it, the faint smell of something chemical wafting up from the lid. I twisted the lid off, the glass cold against my skin, and used the wrench to fish out the paper. It was damp, the ink smudged but still legible. It read, "Keep going. You're almost there." The words sent a chill down my spine. Whoever was running this game wasn't just observing. They were manipulating everything, placing objects, shifting the environment, making sure I couldn't escape this path they'd laid out. I turned back toward the corridor, my breath catching in my throat as I saw something new at the edge of the light. A door. It hadn't been there before, but it was there now, standing at the far end of the corridor, its surface painted black and scratched in places like it had been clawed at. Above the door, a flickering red sign glowed faintly, "Do not enter." The dripping noise was louder now, echoing through the corridor as though it was coming from the other side of the door. I stared at it, the words on the sign burning into my mind as I tried to decide what to do. The voice from the tape recorder repeated in my head, distorted and haunting, "I know who you are." I didn't want to open the door, but I didn't have options. If I wanted to get out of here, if I wanted to win the cash prize, I had to keep going. My hand reached for the door handle, and I hesitated, the cold metal sending a jolt through my fingers. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to turn the handle and push the door open. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning with a sound that felt unnatural in the tense silence of the hallway. The room beyond was darker than I expected. The space was small, narrow, like a box meant to trap someone. The walls were made of cold, industrial metal, and the floor was slick with moisture, pooling in small, dark patches that reminded me of oil. As I stepped further inside, the door slammed shut behind me, a finality in the sound that made my heart skip a beat. The dripping noise was deafening now, like it was coming from all around me. I scanned the room, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The far wall was lined with pipes, their surfaces slick and covered in a strange, dark residue. The sound of water, or something like water, dripping from the pipes echoed around the room, each drop a sharp, almost painful sound that seemed to vibrate in my skull. My breath was shallow, every instinct telling me to leave, to turn and run. But there was no way out, not without finishing whatever twisted game this was. At the center of the room, there was a single chair. It was metal, industrial, and bolted to the ground, its surface smeared with what looked like dried blood. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, and the temperature dropped by what felt like several degrees. I could see my breath now, condensing in the air before me, and I realized that the moisture dripping from the pipes wasn't just water. It was something else, something more dangerous, creeping down the walls. A voice crackled to life through a speaker, distorted by static. "Time is running out. Confess, or the room will take what is owed." I froze, the words sending a jolt of ice through my veins. The dripping noise grew. It wasn't just the temperature dropping. It was the sense of pressure, of something unseen drawing nearer. 5 minutes, the voice said again, its tone mocking. "If you don't confess in the next 5 minutes, the room will kill you." I looked around, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. It was then that I noticed something else. Small, faint markings along the floor near the chair. Lines. A diagram, almost. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the lines formed an outline around the chair, and at the center of that outline was a small circle. A symbol, etched into the floor, pulsing faintly, like it was alive. And then it hit me. The dripping noise wasn't just water. It was the sound of liquid filling the space beneath the floor, moving closer, and it was no longer just the pipes that were leaking. The liquid had started to pool in the center of the room. My stomach dropped. The water touched me and it was freezing. I didn't have much time. I turned toward the chair, my legs weak beneath me. I knew what I had to do. I had to confess. If I didn't, whatever was in this room would take me. The liquid was rising now, slowly but steadily, the sound of it splashing against the walls growing louder, more violent. I could feel the tension, the danger pressing down on me. My throat went dry as I stood in the center of the room, the weight of my past crashing down on me. The water was up to my ankles now, and I could feel it creeping toward my knees, the room growing colder by the second. "I killed him," I finally forced out. "I killed him in the car accident." I didn't stop. I just drove away. The sound of the liquid, the dripping, the rushing, all stopped in an instant. The voice came through the speaker one last time. "It's done. You're free." And just like that, the door in front of me opened. I stepped forward. I could finally breathe again. But as I crossed the threshold, I knew something was going to be different. Maybe I would be caught by the police or worse.